The journalist who leaked Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages to The Telegraph has alleged they show a libertarian Boris Johnson was manipulated into supporting COVID lockdowns by Hancock. They also reveal a more lockdown sceptic, Rishi Sunak, who disagreed with Hancock over the extent of lockdown measures during the pandemic. So I'm asking, have lockdown sceptics now been vindicated in light of these messages, and do they portray Boris Johnson in a good light? Actually, now joining me is a former Labour MP and Minister for Europe, Denis McShane. Thank you very much, Denis. And Director of the Academy of Ideas think tank, Baroness Claire Fox. Claire, I want to get your thoughts just first on whether you think it's right that these private communications were released in the way that they were.
I think that we can all have qualms about journalistic ethics, whether, you know, things given in confidence can be handed over, whether there's a breach of trust. But I think that Isabel Oakeshott has made a good case for this being in the public interest. And I would like to note that I had qualms about a lot of the information that was put in the public sphere. For example, all of the Partygate photos and so on were leaked, weren't they? And they were actually placed, sent to journalists, and they then revealed them. And at the time, nobody said, oh, isn't that breaching private trust? In other words, I think that the more information we have, the better. And because of the slowness of getting an inquiry off the ground, I can understand why, despite reservations, this in the end is in the public interest.
Denis, what do you think on that?
Really agree. Jonathan Powell, a little bit in the news because, of course, of the Sue Gray story. Jonathan was Tony's chief of staff, but from a very different diplomatic background. He's hired really for his foreign expertise as much as his person management. And he just said to me once, Denis, as an MP, a minister, me, nothing is off the record. There's no not a question of not trusting journalists. You talk to journalists, but always assume that anything you say, anything you give them could appear somewhere, maybe not to your credit. So I'm just astonished at Matt Hancock. I never thought he was very bright. I thought he was personable, but not very bright to give, 100,000. And WhatsApp's now worse than Twitter. I mean, we gabble and gobble on WhatsApp like nobody's business.
I do worry, though, that you know, SPADs, MPs, politicians, ministers at the heart of a crisis probably shouldn't have to worry about their WhatsApp messages being leaked. But then again, as you say, Matt Hancock was the, well, numpty, frankly, for doing so, I would say, to someone who is known as being a scoop journalist, always looking for a new story. Claire, do you think it's fair to say that Boris Johnson came out reasonably well from these leaked messages, insofar as he was at least trying, or at least expressing the view that perhaps it wasn't a good idea to at least go into that second lockdown?
I think what's most revealing, Emily, is that there were debates going on in those WhatsApp groups, including Boris Johnson, as you say, Rishi Sunak, all sorts of people, Helen Waitley, raising questions. They were raising the kind of questions that many of us raised about, do we really need to lock down? What about families being able to visit people in care homes? They had all the questions that I think many of us had. And it's not a question of whether they came out well or badly or what have you. They asked perfectly rational, serious questions. The problem was that when we in the public tried to ask those questions, we were immediately closed down and labelled as lockdown COVID skeptics, anti-science, COVID deniers, all of those things that were said. I mean, I raised questions like that in the House of Lords, and I actually found myself on a list put on there by a government minister as a COVID denier, a real smear attempt. So I'm gratified that they were asking the questions. What I really feel is being revealed is that they didn't trust the public to join in that conversation. And when they brought the press conferences to us in which they basically presented everything as definitive, there is no alternative, we have to do this, the science shows that, they didn't ever acknowledge that these were political choices they were making. I mean, we can have an argument. But
Claire,
the point was they implied there was no choice, we had to do it.
But it's also the case that they used public opinion to drive their policy. if these WhatsApp messages are as they appear, that they were thinking about lockdown and thinking about COVID restrictions, but said they didn't want to move too fast opening up because of public opinion wasn't there yet. So they were taking public opinion to decide policy in that way. But then it felt so oppressive at the time, the whole public discourse around this. And I do blame some parts of the media too, as well as ministers and politicians, that those who weren't on board with the whole lockdown thing were silenced.
I don't know if you're referring to me, but I do actually think that the public were treated as a stage army in that regard, not taken seriously at all. I mean, it's one thing saying public opinion, but the point was there wasn't a public discussion, and we were actually demobilised. Remember, not millions, but hundreds of thousands of members of the public at the beginning were willing to volunteer to offer to help the most vulnerable, said they'd go out and, they'd put their names into all sorts of things, organise community help for people who were isolated. And they were basically just told in the end not to do anything. The way that you help is to sit still, stay stum, don't move. And yet that created an atmosphere where you were passively waiting for the latest news. People got frightened because they were isolated. They weren't even able to have a chat with their mates about what was going on. And any attempt at asking those questions, as I say, was closed down. Censorship was deployed in terms of social media. We know that.
Yeah.
We also know that the media, and I think it's important to note that this was not just the government, but it was all sides of the political parties. I mean, sitting in the House of Lords, I have to say the opposition benches were like a baying mob, demanding that lockdown was harder and more vicious. And
well, Claire, I'll bring in Dennis on this one. It did feel at the time that to go against the grain when it came to lockdown, COVID restrictions was not allowed. You felt a pariah in some ways if you were to call out the government's action on lockdown. Do you agree that that was the case, Dennis? Have lockdown sceptics now been vindicated by all this?
Anybody who's sceptical shouldn't need vindication because they're seeking to ask hard truths. Just a personal story. I've got a great German friend who offered me, she loves Britain, got a house here, about £6 million worth of PPE. She had in ready to go from Beijing, highest German standards. I phoned everybody I knew for free, just fly it in here. And nobody would be interested in a free offer like that. And then I found that so many Tory donors were in there getting on a special access to sell at a huge cost, some of it absolutely unusable PPE. But on the main point, no, the COVID inquiry will find out that. I mean, there was, if you like, a lockdown sceptic, Claire. That was Rishi Sunak. And he organised his Eat Out to Help Out. Do you remember that? I mean, he loves stunts dressed up in waiter's clothes, like he goes to petrol stations to fill up his Kia, as if he knew what a Kia is. And he said, Eat Out, Help Out, it cost £500 million, and COVID cases went up by nearly 20%. So maybe some of the kind of sceptic stunt merchants were their own worst enemies. I looked at it across the whole of Europe. I mean, and each country had different approaches. I completely agree that the moment I hear the science says, I duck for cover. But the idea that we all should have been, like Boris Johnson, boozing, sending people out to Tesco's to bring the wine in to all get sort of smashed in the office, I'm not sure that would have been much of a help to containing COVID either. Nobody knows. The Chinese had the most rigorous lockdown policy. They've had to relax it for economic reasons now, and now they've got a huge rise in cases.
But I think, Dennis, that may be, but Claire, if it's the case that government decision, policies that impacted, well, the millions of people that live in this country were based on flawed data and that was not expressed to the public, that is damning. Do you believe that the public inquiry would have looked into that? Were you concerned that the inquiry would have been a whitewash?
Oh, sorry, you're asking me.
Yes, sorry, Claire.
Well, look, the point is it would just take too long. I was listening to what Dennis was saying. I'm not saying that we know exactly what policies we should or could have done. But one thing I want to clarify is that getting COVID and COVID cases were not as threatening for huge swathes of the population as the policies implied. there were people who were very, very vulnerable. And they actually, ironically, ended up getting neglected by this kind of treatment of one size fits all. So the people we should have been looking after were were exactly the same as an 18-year-old. So I just went and spoke at university this day, and I was really struck by the students, how bitter they were about how they were treated. They were not vulnerable from COVID, but they actually had their lives destroyed in some ways for 3 years, and they haven't got over it. So that is one of the problems with having a kind of there is no alternative approach, and that's the way the government presented it. In fact, what I was saying was the only opposition that was very vocal were those who were saying you should do more to close things down. What about this group, this group, this group? So what we never had was a rational, sensible, open discussion. And what you have to do is trust the public to take decisions. When you call people granny killers, it's so insulting. Nobody wanted to put the elderly at risk. The idea that ordinary people were wandering around irresponsibly letting it rip, they would have taken precautions, but we were banned through the draconian.
Well, that's the thing. That's the thing, Claire. We treated children and young people, especially, as vectors of a virus that they were least at risk of, and they were treated as carriers of a virus, and therefore everything had to be closed.